Hi friends, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers. Again, positive and negative numbers are what we call integers, so I've written that nice little note for you up at the top here. Okay, let's get started. When I talk about adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers, I think it's really helpful to think of it as teams. What I mean by that is if we have, and again, grab your notebook, you're going to want to take some notes on this, okay? Let's say we have a team. We've got -4 plus 3. This means we have our negative team has 4 players on it. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Our negative is our red. Our positive team is our yellow, and they have 3 players on that team. Now, each player cancels out. One of these cancels, one of these cancels, one of these cancels. And what I'm left with is 1 player on the negative team, okay? So let's talk about that in a different perspective. Let's say that we have 6 plus -2. 6 plus -2. We've got 2 teams here. We've got our, positive team, where we have 6 players, right? And so we've got 6, 5, and 6. 6 players on the positive team, and then on our negative team, we have 2 players. Again, they're going to, each one of these is going to cancel out. A red and a yellow cancels each other out, and this cancels out. I'm left with 4 players on my positive team, so my answer is +4. Okay, so when you hear me say which team is larger, I'm not asking about which number is larger. I'm asking about which team has more players on it. So if I said something like -7 plus 3, which team is larger? Well, I know 3 is larger than -7, but let's think about them as teams. This is the negative team, and they have more players on it than the positive team. So the negative team is larger by 4. The negative team is larger by 4. Okay, so what happens then if we have players on the same team? Let's talk about that. So we've got this guy. Let's say we have -3 plus -4. All right, so let's get out our negative team players. We've got negative, negative, negative. There's 3 negatives, and then we've got 4 negatives here. Now, none of these can cancel out, so what we have is we've got 3 players on the negative team, 4 players on the negative team. Our negative team is now 7 players big. So you'll notice when the signs are different, you subtract, and the word difference in math means subtract. When the signs are the same, you're going to add them. Okay, so let's talk about now subtraction. All right, let's say that you have 17 minus 7. Well, by now you probably know that that equals 10, but we are not going to subtract anymore. No subtracting. Instead, what we're going to do is add the opposite. Add the opposite instead of subtracting. Okay, so here's what I mean by this. We take our subtraction symbol and we add, and then the opposite of positive is negative. And so now it's a negative problem. So we look at it and we see which team is larger. There are 17 players on the positive team, 7 players on the negative team. So our positive team is larger. So I'm just going to notate that there, but you don't have to write positive when you're answering. By how many? Well, there are 7 more players on this team. And remember, we started with 17 minus 7, which we know to be 10. Oh, see, I'm glad I double checked myself. That's actually 10. Which team is larger? The positive team. By how many? By 10. There are 10 more players. So sorry about that. Thank you. Okay, so let's actually practice that, not off the top of my head. All right, so we're going to add the opposite. Now, sometimes before we do practice that, sometimes you'll see something like this. This is a subtraction, and this is a negative sign. You have to be very careful if you're not using parentheses to be very distinct. You want your subtraction symbol to be different than your negative symbol because you don't want to be your own worst enemy. You don't want to write something that looks like this. If you do write it like this, instead of being your own worst enemy, use parentheses so you can say, hey, I'm protecting that negative so that I know that it's a negative and not just a giant subtraction. Okay, so let's talk about adding the opposite. So I've got on here 17 minus 7. Let's try doing that, but for real this time. All right, so we're gonna zoom in here on these guys. 17 minus 7, we don't subtract, we add, and then the opposite is of positive is negative. All right, looking at 3 minus 7, we add, and then the opposite of positive is negative. Looking, oh, I did 7 and a couple of 7s here. All right, instead of subtracting, we add the opposite. Now looking at this, sometimes you'll get that double negative like I was mentioning. We add, and then the opposite of negative is positive. And on this one, we add, and then the opposite of negative is positive. You'll notice when we add the opposite, we're drawing exactly 2 lines. We're drawing 2 lines and exactly 2 lines. No more, no less. So make sure that when you're adding the opposite, you're very careful about that. But what happens now is we've now turned those into addition problems, and we've already learned how to do addition. So let's talk about that. What we have here is which team is larger? Our positive team. And by how many? The difference between those two teams is 10. All right, which team is larger? Looks like this time our negative team is larger. And by how many? Again, what's the difference there? 4. Okay, so when we have different signs, we are subtracting. When we have the same signs, though, it is still the negative team, and that team is now 14 players big. So when we have the same signs, we want to make sure we're adding. Difference means subtract. So you may want to write that in your notebook. Difference equals subtract, because it's not just when we're dealing with integers, it is other things too. Okay, so now we look at this guy and we have 8 plus positive 2. 8 plus 2, we get 10. Over here we have negative 6 plus 9. Which team is larger? Our positive team has more players, so our answer is going to be positive. By how many? By 3. Excellent. All right, friends, let's talk about how that works when we are dealing with rational numbers. Rational numbers just means fractions and decimals. So let's say we've got this, 1/4 minus negative 1/6. Okay, so we got a subtraction problem here, but we also have a fraction. Remember, to find our common denominator, we can multiply them together, but that's not going to be our least common denominator. If we list out all of our 4s, we get 4, 8, 12. Oh, and I know 6 goes into 12, so multiply this guy by 3, this by 3, this by 2, and this by 2. So I have 3 over 12 minus negative 2 over 12. And remember, we don't subtract, we add the opposite. So add the opposite. Now, we know we're going to do 12 and 5. So we get 5/12. 5/12. Okay, so let's see about these guys. If we have negative 1/4 plus 3/5. Okay, so let's first come up with our common denominator here. 4 and 5, our common denominator is going to be 5, 10, 15, 20. 4 goes into 20. So we are going to be multiplying this time. Multiply this by 5, this by 5, this by 4, this by 4. We get negative 5 over 20 plus 12 over 20. We look at this and we say, okay, how many 20s are we going to have now? Which team is larger? It looks like our positive team, so our answer is going to be positive. And by how many? By 7. By 7. All right. If you have any questions, let your teacher know. Otherwise, great work. All right, friends, I was going to sign off, but I think that we need to practice these rational numbers a little bit more, so hang in there with me if you would like to see more practice on these. Okay, let's say we have this. Negative 5, 6 minus 7/6. Negative 5, 6 minus 7/6. If we add the opposite, you'll see that we get 6 is going to be our same common denominator, but in this case, we've got negative 5 and negative 7, which is still the negative team, and we end up with negative 12. This is where we have to remember to reduce as well. We end up with negative 2. All right, let's do a quick refresh on decimals now that we've covered fractions. Quick refresh on decimals if we are doing positive and negative numbers. Okay, so here's a subtraction problem. We don't subtract, we add the opposite. So we add the opposite. Now, looking at that, we know our answer is going to be which team is larger. Our negative team has more players. And by how many? Remember, different signs means find the difference. So if we do 5.5 minus 1.5, we get 0 and 4. So we end up with -4. -4. So let's try another one of those. If we have 7.3 plus -5.2, we look at that and we see, okay, which team is larger? Are positive, so our answer is going to be positive. By how many? We got to do some subtracting here. Different signs means subtract. 3 minus 2 is 1. 7 minus 5 is 3. That's 8, actually, so maybe we shouldn't do that. That ends up being 2.1, so we end up with positive 2.1. All right, so let's talk about if we have another one here. So let's say that we've got negative 4.2 minus 5.2. Well, remember, we don't subtract, we add, and then the opposite of positive is negative. So you'll notice now both of our teams are negative, so it's still the negative team. And how big is it now? Well, we're going to add these two together in order to find out the team. So even though there was a little subtraction symbol in there, we're adding. Remember, different signs means subtract, same signs means add. So we end up with 4 and a 9, so we get negative 9.4. All right, friends, hopefully that helps you out now for that little extra bit. If you have any questions, let your teachers know.